Welcome back, guys. Today's episode, I am sharing 9 true macabre horror stories. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now let's begin. I was supposed to be in and out. The assignment read quick: verify utilities, photograph interior, note any structural concerns, and secure the property. It was a Tuesday, late enough that most of the windows on that block had gone dark. The house sat at the blunt end of a dead-end street, the kind of road that was promised a cul-de-sac and never got it, where gravel gives up pretending to be pavement. Leaves had blown against the chain link like gathered notes. The lockbox code worked on the second try. When I pushed the door, it didn't swing so much as unlatch itself with a wheeze, pulling away from the frame reluctantly like paper from tape. The air had that smell I've started to recognize: refrigerators left unplugged, rain that never quite dries, carpet that remembers other feet. I clicked my light even though there was a last smear of incongruent daylight in the west window. Habit more than need. It was too quiet in there. Not peaceful. Quiet like something was on the verge of starting, some slow appliance buried in the structure and waiting past its cycle to kick on. You spend enough nights in empty properties and your ears start finding patterns that aren't there, but this wasn't a sound so much as a pressure, a low, steady note that made the glass of the picture window look denser. If I opened my mouth, I could feel it on my teeth. Transformer nearby, I told myself, and wrote utility noise in my notebook where the words looked practical and didn't feel like I was writing about being watched. The living room had been stripped with a kind of politeness. No hole. S in the drywall. No slashes in the cushions. Just the suggestion of a couch from indentations in the carpet and the pale rectangles where pictures had hung. In the kitchen, 2 cereal bowls sat nested, clean and dry, inside a cabinet otherwise emptied. Little savings of effort like that settle in your chest. They say somebody thought this was temporary. I found the crawlspace hatch in the hallway closet. Standard. Cut down a piece of plywood, 2 screws too long for their own good, and slid it aside. Cold came up like it wanted to be the atmosphere instead. I could see the laid plastic sheeting, milky with dust, stretched across the ground to keep damp from climbing, and the ribs of joists, and between them, the occasional glint of silver from the foil-faced insulation stapled to anywhere someone had believed heat was escaping. I took my knees and palms down onto the joists, belly a plank to pull myself along. The dust under a house is a different breed, tastes faintly like stone. My light grazed spider silk and a set of lost screws, and lit a duct junction where the metal had shifted and rubbed itself bare to a shine. Somewhere the low note pressed on the soft parts inside my ear. I moved toward it without meaning to. Behind one span of insulation, the staples had gone in unevenly. The foil was bubbled, not flat, and in that slight curve it caught my beam and tossed me back, my own face smeared in dust. There was a gap along the bottom edge. My glove slid, found paper. Not the thickness of a magazine, stitch-bound, weight in it. I tugged, and a ledger, the old kind, buckram cover, finger-worn corners, eased out of the void behind the foil, leaving a clean rectangle on the dusty joist like a wound. I told myself it was probably a receipts book, something left by whoever tried to make the place rentable and gave up. But I will say this in the plainest way I can. My mouth eats. H got dry looking at it as if I had stumbled on a living thing and was deciding whether to touch it. The ledger wasn't as old as the style wanted me to think. The cover was imprinted with faint gold lines to suggest formality, but someone had written across it with a thick black marker: Roots. The smell came up. Paper and damp and something metallic I only notice in places that haven't been aired in a long time, like coins left on a windowsill. My light made the pages the color of old teeth. Inside, the columns were pre-printed: name, address, date, notes. In the far right margin, a rubber stamp had been used often enough to wear a depression. Returned incomplete. The handwriting was steady, almost clerical, but there were places where the pen had dug at the fiber a little too long, the way people write when they are copying carefully and trying not to shake. I recognized some addresses from former assignments: decommissioned storefronts, a church annex where the roof had sighed itself into angles, an apartment on Randall whose window had been nailed shut with framing nails. It could have been anything: a handyman's schedule, a code inspector's backlog, a social worker's war against triage. I kept telling myself that, out loud, just once, and my voice seemed to stop several inches in front of me like a hand into cold water. The drumbeat of that low vibration under everything grew more insistent, but not louder, not like sound at all anymore, more like a weight on your lungs you notice when you bend. The plastic sheeting at my elbow flexed very gently and then lay flat. It could have been settling. Houses breathe. I've written that sentence 100 times to justify noises. Houses breathe. A page turned under my glove like the paper was exhaling as well. The entries came forward from a few years back, more recent as I moved toward the end. Next to some names, the stamp had been hit hard, returned incomplete, and a smaller, lighter hand had penciled a second note beneath it. Ath, keep open. Carryover appeared again and again like a chiding. One entry had no address, just a description. Blue house, dead end, poor drainage by drive. It was this house. The date was last month. The notes field was left empty, which felt stranger than any remark. At the last page, where the spine cracked like an old knuckle, I stopped pretending the noise wasn't in the paper. My light stuttered and came back and showed me my name, written with the same steady hand, and my address, the small apartment over the upholstery shop that still smells like foam when it's damp. The date was that day's date. A time had been added, half an hour from then, as if I had an appointment I'd forgotten to keep. The stamp hadn't been used. In its place, penciled so lightly I had to angle the beam to pick it up, was a word split across the line, returning. I put my finger on the ink and it came away clean, but the word looked wet in the light like breath on glass. That is the only way I can describe it. I didn't think about how someone would have gotten my home address, whether through HR or a public directory or any of the perfectly boring pathways information takes. I thought about the fact that my address was in a book under a house that was supposed to be unoccupied, and the stamp that had been overused had not been used for me. Somewhere near my head, a staple pinged. It's a tiny sound, but sharp, metal flexing out of wood. A corner of the foil-faced insulation lifted and curled as if something behind it wanted to see and wasn't tall enough. Cold flowed out in a neat ribbon and kinked along my neck. The plastic vapor barrier near my elbow rose very slightly. A single gentle dome, then subsided, leaving a fine powder ring like a halo. I told myself it was my own movement causing it, and then I held still long enough to feel another, smaller rise that didn't agree with my bow. Die. If there was a breath under there, I could not hear it. I didn't see anything move beyond the things I've mentioned. The pressure in the room shifted, that's all, the way it does just before an elevator arrives, and my name, written in the ledger, seemed to develop a texture I didn't want to touch again. It felt like the time had come. Part 3. The Aftermath. Lingering Impact. I backed out, slow at first because that's the training. No sudden movements in tight spaces, no panicked kick that leaves you wedged and stupid. Then my boot found the edge of a joist wrong and I thumped my shoulder into framing hard enough to set loose grit drizzling down the back of my collar. The ledger slid against my chest. I hadn't realized I'd folded it close against me. I swallowed dust that tasted like the underside of a porch. When I reached the hatch and the clean line of house air pressed along the baseboard, my hands obeyed themselves. I put the ledger in my bag. It crossed my mind to leave it where it had been, and it crossed my mind that if I did, I would still be under there in a manner I can't explain. Above ground again, the hall felt too proportional. Rooms looked like stage sets, everything the right depth with nothing behind it. I stood in the doorway and let the night's cool draft do what it could to rinse the feeling off me. Out on the stoop, somebody had pulled up a patch of weeds by the roots and left them to dry in a neat heap, as if they were waiting to be taken somewhere and then the somewhere had failed to happen. The quiet in the block had deepened to the point it had shape. I took pictures. Work demands a record even when your hands aren't convinced, and did what I was there to do. Water, off at the curb, meter stilled. Gas, no smell, tag already hung. Power, meter pulled, the panel door latched with a wire someone had twisted into a tidy figure 8. I wrote Power. R likely cut, and then stood for too long in the living room trying to decide if the hum I'd felt had been real, or if my own head had maintained it. If there had been a transformer, I should have heard it outside too. I didn't. In the car, I took the ledger from the bag to photograph the last page. It's easier to believe something once you make it a picture. My hands were steadier than I expected, but when I looked at the image, it was fine. That's the word. Fine, like a download that starts and freezes at 15% and never moves. The text was there, the letters correct, my name in the same careful hand. The time, though, had changed. Not changed forward, shifted, as if whatever wrote it was trying different answers. It now read the time it currently was. I chalked it up to the kind of mistake you don't see until you look twice. I took another picture. The time adjusted again when I met it with my attention, and I put the ledger back in the bag and zipped the bag as if that would make it behave. On the drive home, each bump on the declined stretch of Broad sent the ledger nudging along the floorboard. I wedged it with my raincoat and told myself rational things. It's a contractor's book, returned incomplete as a note about applications or keys that didn't fit. Your address is in a lot of places. The down bow in the plastic was a draft from the hatch. The staple popped because wood dries and let go. The stamp wasn't used because there hadn't been a decision. It wasn't hard to say those things. It was hard to feel them true. In my apartment over the upholstery shop, the air always carries a faint sweetness, polyfoam and glue, that's been there as long as I have. That night, a low pressure lived under it all, familiar enough that at first I thought I was remembering the house too hard. The walls don't hum, they just sit holding your days. But I stood with my palm against mine for a long moment anyway, expecting to feel something push back. Nothing did. The ledger, under the hall table in my bag, seemed heavier than it should be. I didn't take it out. I couldn't think of where to put it that wouldn't feel like the start of a mistake. I lay down and almost slept. When I slipped under, I dreamed in the practical language of my job. Labels peeling off drawers, masks of insulation catching faces they weren't made to reflect, stamps hammering a word into a place where it didn't quite fit. I got up at 3 and checked the door twice. I checked the bag. The zipper had worked itself open just a finger's width. I told myself it was the cheap slider and an unkind angle. I tell you now because I don't know what else to do with the knowledge that the last page, when I finally looked at it again in the morning to reassure myself, had acquired a single light pencil tick in the margin beside my name. Not a check mark, a resting point. Marked, I guess, like a place where someone had stopped reading and planned to return. The archives room lives in the quiet between HVAC cycles and the after-hours mop. You don't realize how many sounds a hospital drains out of itself at night until you're left with the building's bones. Air moving through square ducts like measured inhalations, the faint tick of a relay behind a wall panel, the squeak and slow soothe of a cartwheel that needs grease, somewhere floors above you. I could feel the place before I could describe it. Antiseptic sweetness worn down to its base notes, old paper, that hint of ozone you get from electronics that never sleep. Telecom sent an email saying their midnight upgrade would take the main system offline. Calls would roll through a fallback attendant console tucked into the archives like an afterthought. Switchboard 0, the subject line read, and for once the name fit the function, a routed-to-nothing line that still needs a person to keep it from going feral. I signed the log, put the headset on its hook, and let Prentice from Telecom talk me through the basics with a pencil tapped against the laminated console card. Answer, route, note. Don't promise anything. If it's urgent, page security. Most of it'll be wrong numbers or nurses calling supply. You'll be bored. Good, I said. I had brought too much coffee and an old city map to mark for a later project. Board sounded like a table you could rest your elbows on. The ledger from the crawlspace stayed at home under the hall table, zipped in my bag as if zippers were seals with jurisdiction. My only concession to the way it had made the air in my apartment feel slightly denser. If I thought about it, I could still feel the buzz of that low pressure in my molars when I bit down, like the building had left some of itself in me. The console was beige, a color invented to pardon dust. Little LEDs ran a line of status lights that didn't mean much unless you were the purse. On who installed them, the screen showed a directory cut down to essentials, operating rooms, ICU, security, a catch-all labeled wards. I scrolled through, half curious, and found something not entirely erased from the list. E-infirm, decommissioned, someone had typed, and then E-store, as if a ward could be demoted to a closet, and that would be that. Its extension lingered like a husk. I made a small practical note to tell Telecom in the morning that it could be removed. If I didn't write it down, I'd forget. Just before midnight, Environmental Services finished the last of their rounds. I watched a pair of orange vests move down the corridor beyond the glass, one pushing a mop bucket, one carrying long rolls of trash that looked like dark anacondas slung over a shoulder. The floors had that new wet shine that makes your shoes go careful. When the elevator doors closed on them, a hush rolled outward as the last purposeful noises tucked themselves away. The hush had a temperature. That's the best way I can say it. It felt like tile cooling after a too hot scrubbing. It sat in my ears and smoothed everything flat. At 12:16 a.m., the main board went dark per plan. The fallback chirped alive with a single, odd cheerfulness, and I reminded myself of the script I'd practiced. Switchboard, how may I direct your call? I tried it once under my breath. It sounded like an imitation of somebody more official than me. I took the headset down and it clicked into a position on my head I didn't know it had been made for. The building steadied around the outline of me. I told myself I would stay awake by cataloging old floor plans for an annex that, according to the map in my lap, had once cut across room numbers that now don't exist. The first ring didn't belong to the console. You learn the shape of a sound fast. Digital rings are neat, modular bleeps paced by software. This one swelled like a breath taken in a tile corridor, and the console tried to throw a skin over it, translating it into something it knew how to display. The screen blinked. Inbound C0. The extension field filled, emptied, filled again with E and firm, then ward 0, then blank. The call timer ticked up anyway. "Switchboard," I said. "How may I direct your call?" The line returned a sound I have been trying to describe ever since. Not static, not fans, but the temperature of a room after mopping. The kind of quiet that remembers footsteps without repeating them. My molars hummed, not painfully, like a tuning fork just brushed. I adjusted the mic closer. "If you're trying to reach a ward, I can get you to—" It laid a tone into my teeth then. So low it didn't travel through the air first. My mouth watered the way it does when you bite aluminum foil. I pulled the headset slightly away, and the tone stayed with me, bone-conducted. I looked at the console details, not because I expected sense, but because doing something with my hands made the feeling more survivable. Root, trunk 0, fallback. Origin, MDF-B. Location, East Wing, DCOM. I had been in MDF-B, the basement room where lines come in, all caged cable and numbered blocks, like library stacks with stricter rules. The East Wing it referenced had been walled over years ago. There was a plaque upstairs where it used to begin, a timeline on bronze with names and the phrase "merged into Maine." "Can you hear me?" I asked, because my training file says to ask that 3 times, and then release. The silence gave itself edges, a small, clean click like a clipboard being set down just out of sight. Then crosstalk. No, that's the old word, but close. The suggestion that 2 parts of a circuit were touching who weren't supposed to, weaving a braided hush. In the braid, spaces fell in a pattern, an almost phrase. I didn't hear my name so much as recognize where a name would belong if there were one to place there. The pauses landed where my name would fill them. I'm trying hard, no. But to be poetic about this, that's just how it happened. I said my name into the headset the way you tell a dog it's okay before you put the drops in its eyes. The line steadied. The tone pulled back until my teeth stopped feeling full. The hush stayed. I routed security on the second line and tried to make a bridge. The console hiccuped. The dies in the screen shifted and then settled as if it had blinked. The switch refused the join, clicking me back alone. I tried facilities. The same. The line didn't drop. It wouldn't let go either. The call timer went past 1 minute. I heard something then that made my heart do the wrong thing for a second. Metal somewhere in the distance echoing itself in a stairwell way. The note you get when a stainless bowl is set down on a stainless table and rotated a fraction to align with the scratches. Then breath, or wind, or the way air falls down a clean hallway after a door swings and stops. "I can't transfer you," I said, and to this day I don't know who I thought I was explaining it to. "If you can tell me where you are, I'll send—" It's absurd how the mind makes shape from lack. My mouth stalled. The call didn't. The hiss and hush arranged themselves around the pace of my sentences like someone was listening closely enough to finish it for me without meaning to. I stood. The headset cord pulled me back like a leash. On the screen, Origin flickered once more and became E00, the kind of number that is more marker than value. At 3:12, something changed so slightly I could have missed it. A drawing in, like a building holding its breath before the elevator arrives. Then the call released the way a held muscle releases. No click, no decisive anything. The timer kept moving a beat past the release and then stopped 2 seconds late as if the call had to be convinced it was over. I took the headset off and placed it on the desk carefully with both hands, as if it had become a cup with water right to the brim. The air felt a degree colder than it had been, but that could have been sweat on my temples evaporating. I set my fingers on the console and watched the pulse of LEDs argue with themselves. For once, I didn't want coffee. I wanted my mouth to taste like something I could name. The ache in my molars receded in a measured taper, like finding the edge of a bruise with your tongue and deciding to leave it alone. Rational thoughts lined up patiently, as if they had been waiting just outside the room. Phantom power on an abandoned pair, bleed from a test trunk, an elevator emergency phone caught in a loop, a janitor's handset left off hook tucked away in a closet, a software table mislabeling an internal loopback as a ward. All the possible boring pathways. I walked them each in my head and found they only matched the event if I looked at them from the far end. Maybe that should have been enough. In audits, it often is. I tried to replicate it. When the next normal call came through, a nurse asking if supply had more syringes in a size they were out of, I routed her and it behaved like a machine again. I pulled up the call log. The line for the event existed. Duration, 000641. Origin 00 Root C0. Notes. I printed it and got a single page that felt warm in my hand. The characters were there but a shade lighter than they should be, like the printer had decided to whisper. I put the page under a metal clip on the board and stood because sitting had started to feel like making myself small for something. Security did their hourly walkthrough and waved past the glass. I didn't tell them. I could have. It's in my job description to put anomalies in writing. Instead, as the building traded out another layer of its night air for whatever aim next, I took my badge and went as far as the east corridor would let me. There's a door with a false sense of ceremony at that end, a newer frame cutting across older tile, paint wrinkled where the wall beneath has tried to shrug it off. Behind the door, negative pressure takes a careful breath from the hall, the way unlit stairwells sometimes do. I held my palm to the seam and felt the minute draw against my skin. The smell was mostly dust and paint and the ghost of lemon, the one cleaning product that believes itself cheerful. I stood there long enough that the hairs on my arm flattened and rose once, not from cold, but from the thought that somewhere in there, a floor remembered being walked. Back at the console, the directory still listed E-Infirm, scratched into the software like a rumor. I clicked edit and hovered, and then didn't. Let Telecom clean their own maps, I told myself. Let the hospital keep its past where it wants it. When the upgrade finished, the main board woke up in a composed way that made the fallback look like a toy. The rest of the night filled with calls I knew how to take, and in their predictability I felt almost good, the way you feel when a word finally arrives in your head after living on the edge of your tongue. It took until I was home for the ache in my teeth to stop completely. I lay down and could feel the room's sounds sort themselves into categories. The refrigerator's compressor, the thin buzz of the streetlight outside, a neighbor's cautious laugh through the wall. When the fridge cut off, the subtracting left behind an outline familiar enough that I didn't move for a while. I breathed with it by accident and then on purpose. This is the part I'm ashamed of, or at least I am careful with. After that night, I listened more. On later shifts, I let lines sit a half-second longer before I spoke. I told myself I was being morose. Geech. Attentive to the slight overlaps machines make when they hand work off to each other. Maybe that's true. Maybe whatever called used the hospital like a mouth uses a reed. Maybe I was the reed. I don't know what the call wanted. Maybe it didn't want anything. Maybe the wanting was mine, for the pattern to resolve into words. The only fact I can give you without garnish is this. For weeks after, when someone said my name from another room, my ear judged their pauses the way the line had judged mine, and for a breath or two I timed myself to a quiet I couldn't put down. Condemnations can feel like mercy. You step into a place that keeps getting asked to be more than it can be, and you get to say, unofficial letterhead, that it doesn't have to try anymore. The duplex was the left half of a pear with a seam down the middle you could have parted with your hands if you'd been patient enough. The stoop had a slope to it that made you aware of your ankles. A hand-lettered for sale sign drooped against the chain link like it had been tired for a long time. I signed the orange tag on the front door, took my photographs of the exterior, wood rot blooming at the sill, a downspout that lifted away from the wall toward nothing, then let myself in. No power by the feel of it. The air had the coolness of rooms left closed too long, and the odor that sits behind that. Drywall dust, a thread of mildew, something faintly metallic. The living room window looked at a narrow side yard where hostas had grown leggy and then given up. I held my breath to listen. The house did not hum, it thought. The file for the property sat in my bag, thick with cross-era paper. I'd skimmed it in the car before I went in. Old inspection cards with bent corners, a 1978 photo of a boiler, past useful life, a typed note from 1921 referring to a capped well. Under back room, sealed with lime brick. No further issue anticipated. Someone in the 1990s had stapled a sketch, the kind with arrow labels to show which direction a person wanted you to see in your head. Back room marked with an X and a sentence written in pencil and traced over in pen later to make it survive. Keep the salt undisturbed, the cautious hands of bureaucracy trying to be a throat clearing. I moved through the downstairs, parlor, dining, kitchen, finding the kind of clues people leave when they imagine they're coming back. A hair tie around a cabinet knob, a patched spot in the wall fresh enough that the papers over it still dreamed of being flat, a forgotten grocery coupon magnetized to the side of a stripped refrigerator. The back door stuck at the threshold even though the wood looked dry. When I forced it and it gave, the hinge made a sound like a secret reluctantly repeated. Beyond it, the small yard had an oval of bare dirt where a kiddie pool had once lived so long the earth had committed to the idea of its shape. Upstairs, the hallway turned twice and then became a short run ending in a door that had swelled just enough to chew at the jamb. The back bedroom. You could tell without touching the knob. The paint around it had burst in a fan of little crescents from the damp behind. I pressed my palm to the panel. Cool, not cold. The smell through the seam made my mouth wet reflexively. Salt and copper, the licked coin taste you get standing on a pier when the tide's doing arithmetic out of sight. When the door opened, the first thing I registered was the light. It arrived sane, from a single intact window facing the yard, filtered by a gray day. The second thing I registered was the floor's sheen, not flooded, slick in patches like someone had breathed on the boards. The ceiling was white, and not just white, but comfortable. No stains, no bulges, no give anywhere I tapped. The drywall seams were crisp, like a diagram. If you dropped a coin, it would reach the boards without wringing water. But the boards themselves seemed dark along the grain, edges beading, and when I moved, my shoe printed briefly, then healed. Humidity does strange things in cramped geometries. You see condensation on panes, rings around outlets. This was precise in its disregard. The room's corners were dry. The center held a slow damp that hugged your ankles and made your socks remember other weather. I set my bag down carefully on the threshold. In older places, you look for what holds a job in place C. The little hacks, a draft snake under a door, painter's tape someone never peeled. Here, I saw a faint line tucked along the baseboard, interrupted where the door had chewed. At first, I thought it was dust caught in a seam. When I knelt and frowned at it with my flashlight, it glittered. Salt. A line of table salt laid thin as a sentence, going the perimeter. I shouldn't have touched it, I can say that now. Then, it looked like one of the many strange attempts people make at having control, like hanging a mirror on the wall facing the leak so the room thinks about another room instead. The note from the 1990s sat in my head with a kind of bureaucratic warning bell, keep the salt undisturbed. It read like superstition converted into a memo. I stood back up and told myself I would note it, photograph it, and not test it, which is, if you know me, the kind of resolution that means testing is a future tense. Moisture meters are blunt instruments for delicate questions, but mine has told me truths before. I clicked it on and watched it sleepily agree that the wall was within acceptable ranges while the floor was not interested in being measured. The little tines left tiny crescents on the board and gave me numbers that didn't track with anything else in the house. I exhaled and the window fogged briefly in a traced oval, as if the glass and I were testing our mirror relationship. Then the fog went the wrong way, not downward with gravity, not sideways with drafts. It pulled up in a hairline along the bottom edge and disappeared. I went to the baseboard and pressed a knuckle to the plaster. The plaster felt oiled? No give. But when I drew my hand away, there was a sheen on my skin that caught in the fine hair and tugged, a micro-drag, and when I looked closer, my knuckle beaded. Not sweat. The droplet formed from air like a thought, and then lifted minimally, as if remembering it belonged elsewhere, and smeared into nothing on the way to the ceiling. I slow. I'd my fingernail under a section of baseboard where the paint had separated and levered it just enough to see. Cold air walked my wrist. The cavity smelled like a dock after the tide drops. Brine and iron and all the small rot that isn't dramatic. The beam of my flashlight hit plaster and the plaster looked slick without being wet. A thin shine arranged in a topography like the inside of a shell. Across it, in pencil darkened with time and damp, someone had written in a tidy hand, "Keep the salt undisturbed." The same phrasing as in the file, only older. The letters had been traced more than once. Whoever wrote them wanted to be heard through layers. A grain at my knee broke the line. My jeans had brushed the salt without my noticing. Not dramatic, just a scuff that turned a clean sentence into a dotted one. In the center of the room, a dome pressed up from nothing like a new blister under vinyl. Not much, the width of my palm. It sighed back down in the time it took me to decide my name in my own mouth. The air temperature dropped in a local way. My forearms got gooseflesh while my upper arms didn't. The sound, a building's background sound, always there, the noise you can hide in, thinned until I could hear the miniature work of moisture owning surfaces. The boards made small, polite pings. In that thinner sound, I heard the hospital again, the hallway hush that had learned the pace of my breathing, and I shortened my breath without meaning to. I made the scuff worse, trying to fix it. That's human. You convince yourself that smoothing the line will restore a kind of thinking the room was doing before you entered. I pinched salt between my fingers and tried to rediscover its path. The crystals stuck to my skin. My fingers tasted like the air in empty swimming pools. While I worked, dew on the floor made itself into beads instead of film. Perfect small globes trembled and then refusing the cue to slide toward the low spot by the window went up. Not quickly, not with a charm showman's flourish. They simply detached and traveled toward the ceiling in a manner that made my eyes water, because something basic in me wanted the direction to be the other way. I held my hand out because that's also human. A bead touched the hair on my wrist, made a sound I felt more than heard, and sprinted up between knuckles as if there were a wick there. Then nothing. Just a haze of cold on the back of my hand. The taste in the room darkened into iron. I took a step backward and my heel landed on the threshold. Dry an instant ago, now slick. I caught the jam and stopped there in the doorway because the idea of putting my whole body in the room felt like the beginning of something I would not get to edit later. I photographed everything. The line of salt, the lagging window fog, the shine on the plaster, the hairline dome that rose and softened as if gauging my attention. The photos looked normal and then wrong the longer I stared. Angles misbehaved, not dramatically, just enough that you'd say the phone had a lens issue. I made a note to run a moisture test under the house if the crawl space allowed, and in the same hand, in the same sentence, without thinking, I wrote the phrase from the wall. Keep the salt undisturbed. The act of writing it felt like retracing a voicemail from a decade ago, your mouth doing someone else's memory. I did one more bad thing. I pulled up the corner of the room's old rug where it tucked under a bed scar on the floor. Beneath it, the salt line continued, and where it crossed the floor's heat register, someone had taped a narrow canvas strip in place and dusted it with enough crystals to fill the gap. They had thought about drafts. They had thought about how a line fails at interruptions. I laid the rug back down as if it were skin. Leaving didn't feel like leaving. It felt like backing out of a conversation with an older relative who has turned their chair ever so slightly away from you. On the stairs, my ankle bones carried cold up my legs. In the kitchen, where the air should have returned to the dull neutrality of abandoned rooms, the smell of brine clung to a plate left in a drying rack so long it had become decor. Outside, the stoop was a little slick from a mist that hadn't otherwise fallen. I stood under an uncluttered sky and had to check the undersides of the railing for drops the way you check your own face in a car mirror for something you can't name. Rationalizations are good shoes. They don't keep your feet from getting wet, but they convince you you're walking on purpose. I tried on several. Capillary action drawing groundwater up through old wood in a pattern you don't see often in our region. A buried well still influencing the microclimate of the room after a century. Salt used as a desiccant in a misguided DIY fix, effective enough to concentrate moisture in the air and redistribute it where it could. A convection loop reversed by drafts in the geometry of the stairwell, static interacting with aerosols, a barometric anomaly from a pressure change I could chart if I had instruments I don't have. Each settled around the shape of what I'd seen, like plastic wrap on a bowl that never quite obeys the curve. At home, I ran the shower just to remind myself the direction water prefers. When I turned it off, I could swear for a second the steam did not lift so much as recede. The bathroom mirror fogged, and a clear path drew itself as if a finger had found me, and then, one notch of patience later, that path filled back in from the bottom up. I wiped it with my palm and smelled the brine that wasn't there. The dome in the center rose again, and in its curved skin I could see, for a breath, a reflection of the window that lagged like the mirror I'd resilvered for the Historical Society. It looked forward, into a room with a missing piece I hadn't left yet. Then it fell. I wrote later that it settled. What I mean is, it reconsidered. The beads slowed. The salt line that I had almost repaired held a jaw. The ledger under the hall table sat in my bag, zippered like a mouth. I didn't open it. It did not matter that the phenomena could be unrelated. My apartment felt slightly denser, like a note I had become used to was half a step lower. The next morning I found a halo of damp around the base of my potted fern, and beneath the pot a ring of white like the line in the bedroom. Minerals from watering, I told myself. Efflorescence. The fern looked fine until I touched a frond and felt the air cling to it before letting go. I called a contact in the department who knows wells. I asked the kind of questions you ask when you want to sound like a person describing a problem instead of living inside one. Could a capped well under a room alter humidity like that? Could a brine layer reverse his dew behavior at small scales? He laughed and then apologized for the reflex. You'd get efflorescence, he said. Salt would creep out of the plaster and ferns. You'd get damp at the walls, not the dead center. Unless there's a vapor barrier that's acting like a... Look, water doesn't go up, not on its own. I returned to the file to read every notation about that back room. A woman's name repeated over 3 decades of correspondence. Requests for inspection because of persistent damp and precipitation indoors. One note from 1964. Proved to nurse, no leak from above. Dew noted on floor, behaving contrary. A faint pencil addition in the margin, same as before. I do not know what before meant in that sentence. The sketch with the warning about salt had been copied twice, traced so many times its lines looked tired and beautiful. I flagged the property for a follow-up I knew would go to a new hire with a camera and a checklist. I typed an email to OC Health asking if we had guidance about salt applications in unconditioned spaces, deleted it. Typed instead that the back bedroom demonstrated atypical moisture distribution and that any mitigation should maintain current perimeter conditions until a cause was determined. I wrote, "Do not vacuum perimeter," and felt ridiculous. I wrote, "Do not sweep," and felt worse. I hit send anyway because my job, at its best, is to put shape around what isn't yet knowable, long enough for somebody gentler to enter it later. At night for a while after, I'd wake with the sense of being watched from the floor upward. Not from the doorway, not from the window, from that low, domestic dark rooms keep under chairs. Once half asleep, I put my hand over the side of the bed and felt air like cool breath moving in a steady exhale from nothing. I told myself radiators do that even when they are off. I told myself that if a room wants to keep an arrangement it has negotiated with itself, the kindest thing is to let it. And still, I keep a packet of salt in my pocket now, the kind that comes with takeout and turns into chalk and humidity, not because I believe necessarily, but because my fingers want to be ready to finish a sentence if I must. The Historical Society keeps its workshops below street level in the cool part of the old bank where the vault used to be. It's quiet in the way that makes you notice the small motors that make quiet possible. Dehumidifiers with the polite persistence of a neighbor's dog, fluorescent fixtures that never fully commit to silence. The building smells like climate control and old glue. Paperboard storage boxes line the walls like an audience that knows exactly when to withhold applause. I took the mirror as a favor to Marta, who runs collections with a librarian's patience and a surgeon's tolerance for repetition. "It's not museum quality," she said, pulling aside an unbleached cotton cover. "But donors don't always care about that. 1890s, maybe. Someone refinished the frame badly in the 60s. The glass is older than the backing. If you can get the foxing managed, we'd like to put it in the front hall for the gala. Donor wants to see it looking back." "Looking back," I repeated, because the phrase had a weight to it. She laughed like she didn't notice. We signed the loan forms. I initialed the space that says, "I will document what I remove and what I add," that I will not introduce new conditions, that any discovery is to be photographed before being altered. The sort of promises that sound like moral statements until you're alone with an object that remembers its own reflection better than you remember yours. The mirror was taller than me by a hand and had that gentle ripple you get in older glass, the surface not quite agreeing with itself. The backing paint had failed in scallops along the edges, exposing islands where the silver had tarnished to void. When you lifted it, the frame hummed against itself, a low fretboard noise that traveled into bone. I laid it face down on padded horses and felt for the screws that came out like decisions. I worked slow around reflective things. It isn't superstition so much as respect. When I was a kid, I pressed my palm to a cold mirror on a hotel door and felt heat rise into my hand that I couldn't explain. It could have been halogen lighting trapped behind glass. It could have been nothing, but the feeling reached forward into now. I moved my tools to the side so I wouldn't catch my own face in any chance corner. A roll of paper towels, nitrile gloves, a bottle with a brown label that did not need me reading it aloud to remember that I should not breathe it in. You do not have to know the names of the chemicals to feel your mouth adjust to their intentions. Before I started, I stood the mirror upright to get a last look. The workshop reflected in the old film the way you see a room on an afternoon when you had meant to nap and didn't. The ripples made the shelves look like they were breathing very slightly. When I moved, my reflection caught, then slipped a half pace behind me, and I told myself it was the shiver of glass trying to find a plane in its own age. There was a hairline crack at the lower right that no one else had noticed yet. I did not say that part out loud. I flipped the piece again and began with the usual. The backing paint softened under solvent and persuasion. The old silver leaf came up in stubborn flakes like scabs that had learned your tricks. I kept a tray to catch what lifted, though it was already beyond salvage except as documentation. As the first arc of backing came free, the glass underneath looked clean, indecently young. It's always like that. History's skin off, a bright surprise, and then something in it shifts to remind you you don't get to make it new, only newly visible. In the corner, where the failure had started, there were faint marks that didn't belong to manufacture. Not scratches, not accidents. Something deliberate that the silver had hidden and been den by. I printed more labels than I needed and wrote on the first one in the neatest hand I could manage. Underlayer, marks, pending identification. I did not admit then that I already felt, in the small part of my head that names things too soon, that they were eyes. It takes hours to deback a mirror properly, and in those hours the workshop kept me company with its tiny mechanics, air shifting at the vent, the rubber mouth of a dehumidifier taking shallow sips, a clock upstairs that insists on an extra click between minutes. When I had the backing clear across the lower quadrant, the ghosting stopped being ghosting and announced itself. On the underside of the glass, in graphite darkened by time and something more ferric, someone had drawn eyes. Not a pair arranged as a face, not anything so theatrical. Single eyes, repeated hand, each slightly different but practicing the same intent. Lash lines lightly suggested, an iris that only exists in a certain angle of light, the suggestion of a socket with no head to belong to. Between them, a phrase in a small, disciplined script that must have been made either before the original silvering or between resilverings. No one had logged. Not for first sight. I took pictures I didn't want to look at. The way you photograph the inside of a wall you've opened, knowing you can only explain what you know how to name. The chalky graphite smelled faintly of coins even before I admitted it. I traced the letters with light and saw where they had been retraced by another hand, a later caretaker who believed reinforcement mattered. I logged it, the way the forms say, and felt the silliness of a digital field called cultural note into which I typed, phrase discovered behind original silvering, likely a joke or superstition. If it were a joke, it subjected itself to the patient part of a joke, waiting a century to land. I cleaned and masked and did what I was paid to do. The underdrawing would be sealed under the new film of silver, documented but hidden again. There's an ethic to resto. Ration that isn't so far from archaeology. You show your work and you leave a record for kinder eyes. That's the rule. I followed it. When the new silver settled in its chemical way, it moved like frost arriving on a windshield, but the opposite, shadows yielding instead of advancing. There is a moment you never get to share with anyone else because the video never quite catches it, a bare pane deciding to become a mirror. It's beautiful. Even now, I'm not sorry I saw that part. I rinsed and backed the new layer with paint and let everything cure the way the instructions had promised. When I turned it upright, the room came back to itself in the glass. Except the room did not arrive with me. My hand lifted, the hand in the mirror considered and then followed, half a breath behind. I have seen slow glass, old panes wobble, coatings react to light. I know the tricks tired eyes play after concentrating on one field too long. This was different. I tried to make it ridiculous by counting out loud. 1, raise fingers, and mirror raised. 2, tilt head, and tilt. I sighed and told myself I was primed to see lag because of the work, because of the hospital, because I was tired. I blinked long and stared without moving and watched the bench behind me catch up to now one sigh late. Then the mirror started disagreeing not just about time, but about facts. On my work table to my left, a roll of blue tape lay across a chisel. In the glass, that piece of tape wasn't there yet. The table was clean of it. The abacus of inventory in my head shrugged. I looked down at the real table. The tape was there. When I looked back up, the tape appeared in the mirror as if you had rewound the last seconds and let them play again, and now the sequence had aligned. I told myself I had missequenced my own glance. I tried a test that felt childish even as I did it. I slid my bag closer to the table edge. In the mirror, the bag continued to sit against the chair leg. In my version of the room, my hand hovered over the table for a moment like a bird that hadn't decided where to land. One heartbeat later, the bag nudged into view in the glass. I pulled my hand away as if from a hot element. The new silver held its own, beautifully even. No ripple. The lag lived in the arrangement of the world, not in the glass. The phrase I had sealed back there earned itself, not for first sight. A clarity arrived in me that I don't like to measure when I remember it. I wanted to see if the mirror knew more than the obvious, and I didn't want to find out. The door to the hall stood closed in real life. In the mirror, the door was already open. It didn't swing. It simply proposed openness and waited. I didn't move. When I finally tested the knob, my fingers found it unlatched, ready to go without resistance. The mirror's version had not predicted so much as arrived slightly ahead of me and sat there, patient. I stood there long enough to learn how my breath sounded when I tried not to hear it. In the glass, a white rectangle winked on the workbench, a folded rag that wasn't present yet in the room with me. I reached into the drawer and found it where I keep rags. I set it down where I had seen it and watched the mirror catch and smooth out the difference like a duvet padded flat. When I looked up into my own face, I couldn't trust it. For a second, just a second, the person in the glass stood a half step behind in a way that made my molars act up again like the switchboard night. Then she arrived and made me myself again. I did what you do when you don't want to name a thing. I covered the mirror with the cotton shroud and told myself objects need to rest between treatments, that the backing pain tea should cure overnight before we lugged it upstairs, that there was no reason to be in a hurry. I labeled the shroud with my initials and the date. My handwriting looked like it had been practiced for this exact situation, and the thought made me nauseous in the quick, clean way a bad smell can. Marta found me in the hall with my hands in my pockets like I was waiting to be told what to do with them. "How's our minor miracle?" she asked in her cheerful, curatorial way. "Stable," I said. "Better than I expected." I held up my documentation. "Also, drawings under the silver, eyes, a phrase. I photographed it all." She frowned in a way that said both "oh" and "of course." That piece came from a portrait studio's waiting room, according to the donor. The widow said her husband never liked to have it in the house after the shop closed. She made a joke, I think, something about not looking at yourself first thing. That generation loved to laugh about superstition as a way to not name it. "Not for first sight," I said, because saying it out loud made it smaller. Marta tilted her head. "Was that what it said?" She wrote it down. "Well, let's keep the back of house card discreet. We don't want to put that on a label. People love a haunted thing too much, and then a donor complains." I nodded like a person living an ordinary afternoon. When she left, I lifted a corner of the shroud as if checking on a sleeping child. The cloth's weave came into focus and then slipped as the mirror announced, by making the room slightly different, that it was a minute ahead of me again. The empty chair in the reflection was the one I was about to move. I dropped the cloth like it was a burning pan I couldn't set anywhere safe. I turned off the lights and watched. In the glass's wan version of the room, the switch not yet fall in my hand. It did, a blink later. I left the workshop before the mirror. Roar could show me whether I would look back at it again that day. At home, I tested the ordinary mirrors the way a person squeezes the bruise that might be nothing. The bathroom gave me back what I offered at the speed of a bathroom. The door mirror obliged with all my bad angles at once like an unkind friend in real time. My phone's dark screen, halfway to mirror, bore my face first as a world and then as a thing in it, nothing more. I wanted to ask the ledger in my bag what it thought of getting pictures of a future that was the length of a sigh away. I left the bag closed. I went to bed and woke at 2 to the sound of nothing, of checks performed by something I had become too used to timing. The quiet had edges. It did not feel empty. It felt arranged. The next day I went back early and stood 6 feet from the mirror and let the lag show me small kindnesses. I don't think were kind. The door already open, meaning I wouldn't bang my hip. The cup on the table emptied, reminding me I would have spilled. My own mouth softened a degree into the face I wear when I'm about to decide to look away. I stood until my shoulders realized they had been bracing too long. I wrote on the treatment card, "Minor temporal lag observed. Appears to predict immediate arrangement changes. Recommend minimizing first view interactions." I didn't know if I was allowed to write that. I wrote it anyway and slid the card under the shroud where only I would find it. Over the following weeks, I caught myself pausing before every reflective surface like I owed them something. At stoplights, I glanced in the rear view and listened for the beat where the world could be 1 second kinder if it wanted. When I passed the Historical Society on an ordinary day, I didn't go in. I didn't want to find out if the mirror had had time to learn me better. I didn't want to be the person who could predict the shape of an afternoon by the way a rag appeared in the corner of a row. I wasn't in yet. There were 2 failures of resolve. The first, I told a friend in the gentlest terms that the mirror had made me feel weird. He laughed the way people do when they open a closet and something falls and they're embarrassed by the alarm. "Pareidolia," he said cheerfully, naming the trick our brains play on quiet patterns. Textbook. The word fit in the mouth. It didn't lay itself against the facts. The second, I waited one night until the museum was empty enough that my footsteps sounded like a chart no one reads, and I uncovered the mirror and stood right against it, so close my breath would have fogged it if it were a regular room. In the glass, the lights were still on. The door to the hall was still ajar. The bench held a folded rag I hadn't yet found, and there I wasn't. The bench, the door, the lights, arranged for a person who had already left the frame. I took a step back and my body remembered how to be heavy. I covered the mirror carefully, matching the cloth's edges the same way every time, the way you do to keep something asleep. I locked the workshop door and checked it twice. I checked it a third time because I didn't believe the first 2 that the future would wait for me. I said yes to the herbarium because I wanted a dry room. After the mirror in the bedroom that let water think upward, my head had been keeping its own weather. The university's collections live 2 floors up from the biology labs, behind a door that hums with an agency I trust, climate control. There's a comfort to the way an herbarium edits the world down to crisp paper, small brass label clips, and order. You can hear that order, steel cabinets with rubber gaskets closing with a polite hush. The gentle breath of a dehumidifier that knows what it's for, the librarian's cough of a barcode reader. It smells like clean cardboard, old cellulose, and the faintest ghost of camphor from decades when people kept pests out by making rooms smell like a drawer in someone's grandmother's house. A friend in city natural areas had passed my name on. We promised them a short-term pair of hands for backlog, she'd said. You're good with paper, and you don't mind rules. It was a gentle way to say I know how not to become a problem in a room where everything is precisely itself. The head curator, a man whose patience looked like a cardigan, walked me through the basics. Freeze new accessions to kill beetles, handle sheets by the edges, never pick a pressed flower off a mount no matter how casual the loss looks. Specimens are time, he said, and the words stuck to my ribs because they were so plainly right. My job was simple. Rehouse a grant's worth of municipal plants collected from vacant lots and neglected rights-of-way, update the database from the typewritten labels, and pull a short list of historical sheets for digitization so donors could see their city restoring itself in tiny ways. The cabinets were arranged in long, narrow corridors that punished clumsiness. Each drawer whispered the same small breath when I opened it. 15 or 20 cream-colored sheets cradling lives. Made flat, stems taped like measured thoughts, flowers pressed into accessories of themselves, roots scrubbed and cleaned until they looked like handwriting someone had tried to erase. I settled into the kind of rhythm that convinces your bones you're doing something good. Label, check, scan, new folder. I read the names the way a person reads a neighborhood they've never visited. Coneflower and knotweed, smartweed and foxtail, the mundane heroinics of things that grow where people forget them. I wrote neat because the room asked it of me. I breathed slowly because the cabinets liked it. The folder was in the second row from the end, filed backward so that its tab faced inward. That's not unheard of. People do it when they're in a rush or when they're distracted enough to turn their hand without noticing, but here it looked like a decision. The card tucked into the tab sleeve had no accession number. In careful pen, in bloom, do not open. The hand was not the curator's. The ink had the faint velvet a felt tip gets after a week of use. Someone had written over the same sentence in pencil below, as if to add a second, quieter voice. I didn't open it. I slid the drawer closed and made a note on my pad with a box to check later. Query odd folder. The box looked patient. I wanted to be the kind of person who left it unchecked forever. Across the hall, the fluorescent lights sang their thin vowel. If I held very still, the tone settled between my teeth in the old way. The place sounds go when you aren't sure they belong to air. I rolled my shoulders and thought about ordinary things. Which bus I'd take, what I'd make for dinner, whether the ledger under my hall table had arrived at another tiny mark in the night while I slept. I opened another drawer and wrote down one more careful Latin name and felt a calm I didn't trust yet, because calm that arrives like a curtain sum. Times hides a stage I'm not ready for. The backward folder waited. The words on its tab faced the steel back of the cabinet like a person turned toward the wall. In bloom, do not open. It felt like the inverse of everything I'd been taught in rooms like this. Open, observe, document. I wrote the words on my pad as if copying them would count as obedience, and turned away. I lasted until lunch. After a sandwich eaten in the stairwell with the botany grad students passing through their vocabulary like coins, I went back to the cabinets and opened the drawer as if I were clearing a plate. Habit took me to the backward folder before the part of my mind with better manners could stop me. Just look, I said to no one with the soft authority of a person about to bend a rule they find interesting, and I tipped the folder toward light. It was colder in that paper, not temperature in the HVAC sense. Cold the way mint is cold, precise and bright, a clarity along the sinuses, a taste at the edge of the tongue like light through a bottle left in snow. The sheet inside was standard, heavyweight, deckled. The specimen mounted on it was correct, at first glance, a spray of leaves arranged in an arc, a slender stem with a terminal inflorescence pressed in a photographer's pose, taproot cleaned and coaxed to behave. The tape was the right tape. The penciled cross-hatching where someone had toned down a glare was the kind of care I trust. But nothing on the paper had weight. I know the difference a pressed plant makes. Its moisture long gone, it becomes a stain that holds shape, brown leaching into paper like a shadow. This plant left no shadow. The paper beneath remained cream, as if it had been mounted yesterday and never learned what to do with loss. When I moved my hand over it, the light made the edges sing, and not just from gloss. The paper seemed to ask my hand to move again in exactly the same way, like a muscle memory someone else's body had rehearsed and lent to me. The label was a small rectangle with typewritten lines familiar from another era. Genus, species, habitat, date, collector. The type bounced the way only older machines do, letters slightly imperfect as if trying out for themselves in front of an audience. I read it 3 times and took in nothing. At the edge of my sight, the words tried out other arrangements. Not anagrams, not magic, just the way your eye sees a thing it has decided it would rather not recognize in its current order. I looked straight at the G in genus until my eyes watered and the room remembered me, and the word beeswaxed itself back together. I touched the corner of the label with a gloved finger. It felt warm in a particular way, like a phone that has been in your pocket buzzing to itself. The fluorescent fixtures overhead started to thrum, not like a room, but like a vein. When I breathed, my chest met the lights. They kept time with me, or I with them. I shut my mouth to test which was true and found the tone in my molars again, the one from the hospital line, as if the building had found a way to talk through any wire I offered. There was no pollen. There should be pollen, caught as dust. A yellow that writes itself on the inside of folders and fingers. When I brought the sheet closer, the scent sharpened. Not floral, not even green. Cold, bright and clean to the point of antiseptic, like winter taken apart into its simplest notes. In that scent, the labels of other sheets in the drawer rearranged themselves in my periphery into words that made too much sense. Returned, keep open, carry over. I looked straight on and they fell back into Latin the way a flock shapes itself into birds when you stop trying to make it into weather. I leaned in and a small fog gathered on the glossy surface of the specimen. The wrong way around. On a dead plant from my breath? It should have been nothing, a film that disappeared. Instead, moisture appeared across the sheet itself where no plant touched, faint, then firmer, as if the paper had learned to grow dew. I wiped it with the back of my glove, and the patch cleared. 5 seconds later, a palm made itself there, life-size. The heel, the lines, the cupped hollow at the center where your hand wants to hold water. It was not ink. It was wet. It did not belong to me. The glove was dry. I pressed my own hand near it. The 2 shapes did not share a geometry. I tried the normal playbook. I checked the cabinet gasket. I checked for a cold draft down the back. Everything was courteous, shut, obedient. The room's relative humidity, posted on a small LED by the door, held steady at 42%. The number did not blink. The palm evaporated to nothing while I watched, like a decision changed. I moved the folder an inch and the fluorescent tone hiccuped and returned in a new key that I recognized. The exact pitch my apartment refrigerator finds when it's about to cut out. I thought of salt, the phrase from the back bedroom, keep the salt undisturbed. The specimen's label had a line for locality that, if I'm honest, said a street I knew too well. My city in small letters that looked borrowed from a different story. The collector's name was a set of initials I've seen in old municipal inventories nobody reads anymore. The date was off. It read a date a week from now. I put my hand on the folder to close it, and the cold rose under my palm, not like winter, but like a fever, just before it breaks. I closed the folder gently, like lowering a lid onto a pot that's threatened to boil. The air around me returned to herbarium air, dry, fair, a room that wants only to be what it says it is. I wrote down, in the least adjectival language I own, what had happened. Specimen mount shows no discoloration from plant tissue. Label type inconsistent with others in drawer. Temporary condensation on sheet surface formed in shape resembling a hand. Cold volatile odor present, not camphor. Recommend. Consult curator before rehousing. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it, backward, the words facing the steel wall. It felt like returning a letter to a neighbor's mailbox after reading it and hoping no one had seen you. I didn't say anything to the curator. He was helping a volunteer pick a reference for a sedge. His teaching voice was the kind that makes you want to be better at listening. In bloom. Do not open, I could have said. And he would have had a story about the humor of an old field botany professor who didn't want his students messing with a favorite specimen. Instead, I asked about the freezer log and whether I could scan the next stack while the room was empty. He nodded, pleased. I took the stack and sat at the scanner and watched the bar of light make slow work of turning physical into image. In the glass of the scanner lid, I caught my face and checked it for lag out of habit. It arrived with me, ordinary. Rational lists cued themselves, polite as always. Residual solvent off-gassing from a recently treated sheet. Static causing dust to behave oddly. An air handler cycling in a way that made the light synchronize with my heartbeat, migraine aura presenting as textual instability at the edge of vision, a camera-ready trick of humidity sitting on the surface, finish of paper with unusual sizing, a staffer with a sense of humor filing a folder backward to keep a joke alive, a handprint made earlier by someone not as careful with gloves as they should be, reactivated by my breath, my own want for pattern flexing the safe edges of a room that T rewards belief in systems more than most. I tried each thought on, they hung right and didn't feel like my size. When I stood to leave, the scent lifted with me, faint as if I'd misremembered winter and was now being corrected. In the hallway, a student hurried past and the pages of her notebook fluttered twice as if a draft had claimed them. The fluorescent tone gentled to the register of electric weather I've learned to stop noticing. I signed out, wrote the accession numbers I had touched, and left my name in a neat hand that always looks more confident in rooms like this. On the bus, the black of my phone screen showed me back with the way faces look under transit lighting. Factual. I breathed on it to fog it and couldn't help it. A clear oval held at the back of the haze a second longer than it should have. I wiped it clean on my sleeve and told myself I was done for the day. At home, the ledger under the hall table sat in its bag like I'd left an animal asleep there and was trying not to wake it. The apartment wore its usual evening sounds. When the refrigerator cycled off, the subtracting gave me the sick small relief I get now when I've survived the second before a piece of machinery proves it is still itself. I put the packet of salt I carry in the bowl where I keep keys and tried not to assign that placement meaning. On my desk, the plant from my mother's kitchen shed a single pale leaf. The leaf lay without stain on the wood as if it had been cut out of paper and then decided not to own the surface that had held it. I woke once to the smell, sharp and clean, the way a cold grocery store aisle feels when you walk past sealed herbs. My hands had made 2 wet ovals on the sheet in front of me where I'd fallen asleep over notes. Not sweat. The air was cool. The marks were too round and neatly placed, as if an archivist with better manners than mine had reminded me to put my hands on the paper where they could be recorded. The ovals evaporated toward their edges first, the center last, like eyes closing. A week later, before I could decide whether to tell anyone, the herbarium sent a cheerful newsletter to its volunteers. A photo at the top showed a student holding a favorite specimen from the municipal collection. The caption read, "In bloom, kept safe, do not open until digitized!" Exclamation point. I stared hard enough that my jaw hurt. In the picture, the folder was right way round. My chest went tight with relief that felt too simple and wrong. I closed the email and opened it again. This time the caption read, "In bloom, do not open." Period. Maybe they had edited. Maybe my mail app had hiccuped. Or maybe the words want what the plant wanted, to show up in the way they were meant to be seen when someone is ready to make a different kind of record. I have not gone back. The curator left me a voicemail saying he had set aside a cart for my next shift and that he had a question about an accession card he couldn't read. His voice made me want to answer immediately. I didn't. I keep thinking about that palm on the paper, not mine, returning itself after I wiped it away. If something needed a witness, it found one. Whether it was the plant or the room or the building's way of timing me, I can't say. The only true thing I can end on is this. I catch myself reading street signs twice now. Once quickly and once against the beat of a quieter voice behind them that wants the letters to say, carry over, keep open, returning. The microfilm room lives down 2 flights in a compromise, the kind of hallway that was meant to be public once and got repurposed for boxes. I like it for reasons I wouldn't defend. It's orderly. The cabinets can't lie about what they hold. The shelves smell like dull paper and warm plastic and that thin vinegar note that means acetate is losing the argument against time. The lights are fluorescent but restrained. They have the thrift of a library that learned to be quiet before it learned what it was for. I had a small, honest reason to be there. A records request had come in for photographs of a service corridor demolished in the early 80s, the basement run under the old Commerce Annex before the building was folded into itself and erased. We sometimes filmed walkthroughs of properties before they were condemned, insurance, appeals, a way to prove we'd seen what we said we'd seen. Those films get reduced onto microfilm in batches, a practice that should be over by now, but this city likes to keep a few tricks that rely on cogs and lamps instead of code. When networks go down, microfilm is the only machine that keeps pretending you're in charge. Arliss from Records handed me the key to the steel cabinet and said, "We close in 7. If you're still working, hit the push bar. It sticks." Then she left me with the peculiar company of things that wait well. Inside the cabinet, reels sat in labeled boxes like fat black coins. 12A, 12B, 13A. Someone else's handwriting had been wedged into the sequence with a felt tip that went fuzzy at the edges. 14B. Not for public access. A square of masking tape on the box lid had been re-adhered so many times the adhesive had turned the color of tea. There's an etiquette to other people's warnings. I read them as a courtesy and put them back like borrowed clothes. Not for public access could mean anything. Duplicate material. Conflicting addresses. A reel too damaged to survive another run. It could mean nothing. A joke that outlived every person who knew how to tell it. I set 14B on the table and let my hand rest on the lid long enough to pull in and release a breath I didn't know I'd reserved. The reader warmed under my palm with that old house warmth, coiled, patient, discreet. I threaded the leader through the rollers, around the gate, under the lens. The machine protested once where a roller had gone oval with age, then decided to work. The glass on the reading surface showed the room back to me at a softness I liked. My hands, the coil of the reel, a cup I shouldn't have brought next to a sign that asked me not to. When I turned the crank, the leader flicked through numbers, and a title card with a piece of black tape over the name made the machine's little motor change its mind about its own pitch. I told myself nothing about it wanted to be a story. I'm not a sleuth. I do my job and write down what a place does when it thinks no one's looking. The ledger from the crawl space was zipped where I'd left it, under the hall table at home, and my dentist would probably tell me I've started clenching at night from the ache in my molars that comes on when a hum decides it knows my mouth. In the microfilm room, though, the lights held their tone. The hum belonged to the lamp and to the motor and to the quiet. This part of the building believes in the way some people believe in sleep. I cued the first frame into focus. Basement corridor, fluorescent fixtures in rows, tile the color of old milk, the kind of picture you only take to prove you took it. Someone had written in neat block letters along the bottom edge, Survey, E-Wing, B1. The E-Wing doesn't exist anymore except as a door that leans on memory. I put my fingertips on either side of the machine and turned the crank with that careful sas. Pete it likes, the way you keep time for someone who can't hear you but knows the shape of your attention. The frames behaved like they'd been taught to, and I believed in rules for exactly 3 turns. Corridor, one more step. Corridor plus a stubborn elbow of conduit kept by inertia and tape. The light in the pictures had the exhausted quality fluorescent tubes get when one end starts to go. No flicker in the frame, but you can tell the ballast was tired the day the camera passed it. A shadow rode the bottom of the image. Somebody's shoulder, the operator's breath fogging the lens between seconds. It's an intimate thing, watching the world calculated by someone else's lungs. Even reduced to frames, I could feel the rhythm of the hand turning the camera, as if a person had planned their next step along my fingers. Dust specks on the reader glass aligned themselves with specks in the image in a way that made me check the focus twice. I wiped the glass with the little square of felt that sits there for that purpose. The specks that belonged to the room vanished. The ones that belonged to the image persisted. When I leaned, my cheek met the bottom edge of the reader's plate, warm, and the thrum of the tiny fan resolved into 2 notes, one the machine's, one that low house pressure I've pretended I could forget. My jawbone carried it the way phone calls carry you when nobody else can hear. I cranked. The corridor turned a corner and came to a door marked C2 in stenciled paint too white for the wall. Somebody had chewed a piece of tape diagonally and stuck it over part of the stencil like a bandage. Under the picture, pencil noted, not on plan. Next frame, the door a hand closer, the paint wrinkled where something beneath it wanted out. I leaned back to take in the edges and felt my breath push a halo onto the reader's glass. The halo held where it should have cleared. A filmy ring placed wrong, not on the glass, not on the room, but inside the image, as if the operator's breath and mine had met in a small, mutually agreed place. The notation shifted. What had been pencil resolved into typed letters without me looking away, the way labels have done lately when I give them too much attention. Not for public access, said the bottom margin where survey had been. The words ghosted like something you might see on a transparency set on top of a page. I blinked and the original survey line steadied. I cranked one more frame. The camera passed through C2 without the decency of a jump. 1 frame, at the threshold. Next frame, inside, immediate right-hand wall. It's the sort of edit people make when they're alone and know where they're going. The room shown was a narrow run, a service corridor piggybacked on a structural plan, too small to be any place a person would bother with unless they had to. Fluorescence overhead buzzed through the film the way a wasp chooses a frequency and stays there. The walls were painted the color of caution left out in weather. There were no pipes, no equipment, no reason. My mouth went metallic in that harmless way that makes me check if I've bitten my lip. The frames advanced into a space that took on the proportions around me like a tailor before you've said what you're having done. A panel with a hairline crack appeared on the left. On the reader table beside me, a scratch I know by heart bisects the laminate in the same place. The frame showed a pedestal ashtray the city decommissioned in 1999. In the corner of my room, the ghost of where it had once stood, a circular scuff, announced itself to me for the first time. I don't believe in messages. I believe in rooms that remember being other rooms. I told myself so, and my hand betrayed me by pausing over the crank like a person about to put their palm on a hot stove anyway. It should have been a dead end. The as-built drawings end the corridor there and a neat slab poured at some later date. On the film, the camera rotated left to face what should have been wall. The wall wasn't. A door notched the paint, a whisper of a seam without hardware, a line where contractors had talked themselves into believing they could make absence do for a door. The next frame sat with the lens very close to that seam, the grain of the paint too intimate, the texture almost audible. The bottom margin collected a pencil line like the operator couldn't help themselves, not on plan again, underlined. I cranked once more. The image changed like a person would turn their head if someone had called their name behind them, not down the corridor, not toward the seam, back, into a room whose measurements rearranged themselves as if they were taking the measure of me. The microfilm reader's rectangle glowed inside the image like a tame moon. On the distant desk in the distant picture, an object lay where I never put objects. A small rectangle, the size and scuff of the packet of salt I keep in my pocket now without admitting it means anything. There was a chair. It was the chair I was sitting in, but 1 foot was out of true by a fraction, the amount I fixed last summer with a sliver of folded paper. In the frame, the sliver had not yet been slid in place. The machine's lamp fought my body's heat and won. I could feel the image looking back at the exact space where my face would be if I leaned 1 inch closer. I stopped the reel with my hand like you stop a thing you love from rolling off a table. The room returned to the size it had been when I went under. Fluorescent, paper dry, obedient. My breath sounded like a person's, not like a diagram. I lifted my hand and stood because sitting felt like giving height to what didn't need it. The crank rested in its notch with gentleness of a decision postponed. I told myself to rewind. I told myself to release and make the machine show me frames I had already seen so I could declare the trick harmless. What I did instead was print. The microfilm reader's printer is a compromise layered on a compromise. It hums like a refrigerator that's lying to itself. I pressed the button and the machine spat out a sheet warm as breath and light as a suggestion. The image was there. The corridor turned into my room, the glow of the reader inside the reader. The chair I sat in empty. The rectangle on the table that looked too much like the packet I refused to dignify by calling talisman. But the printed version had lost a layer of conviction, like a photocopy of a sky. The margins looked like they'd been erased and redrawn by someone hurrying. I printed again. The second print came a shade darker in the places I didn't want dark and lighter where I needed edges. On the bottom of the page, where the original had had no annotation, a filament of pencil declared, "Returning." The filament split and turned when I blinked and then it was gone, and the bottom margin looked as innocent as a cast-around net on a calm day. Rational movement works like this. You put the reel back in the box. You write in the log what you took and what you returned. You file the box where it lives. I did each step with the kind of neatness that makes me suspect I shouldn't trust myself with neatness. I added a line on the request slip for Arliss to see. 14B heads. Damaged? Please advise. Then I scratched the question mark out. No one likes a person who brings them puzzles when all they asked for was a copy of a corridor to show a judge. On my way out, I pressed my palm to the push bar. The bar complained the way Arliss said it would, and the door did the thing I now accuse doors of, held itself as if a breath had decided to balance on the other side and the hinge hadn't worked out how to be part of the arrangement. The East Wing plaque upstairs reflected a bright slice of me that arrived with me as if nothing else had learned a new rhythm. I went home through streets that behaved like streets. I didn't take the print out of my bag on the bus. I did check my pocket to feel for the salt packet. It bent under my thumb and thought about dissolving. I held it there until my stop. At the hall table, the ledger looked like calm. Zip open, zip closed. When I put my hand on it to move it aside to make room for the print, the binding warmed as if it had been living under a small lamp. I don't think about that part if I can help it. I set the print next to the ledger and stood over both like I was trying to pick which difficult friend to call first. The printed room had my chair without its paper shim. My actual chair had the shim. I pulled it out and the chair rocked once and then decided to sit the way it had before. The move felt like poking a sleeping dog because you're sure it's dreaming about your name. I tried to tell myself reasonable stories. 14B is a duplicate of a tape I don't have context for. The operator on the original run made an error and doubled back into a room that coincidentally looks like mine. The microfilm reader's light introduced glare that made the image seem to breathe. The packet of salt is a rectangle like many rectangles. I don't know how to name the way my skin recognized the exact temperature of the room inside the frame as if I were standing in it. It's dramatic to say I felt watched. I didn't. What I felt was measured. A tailor in reverse, someone taking in the dimensions of a room to fit them to the person already inside it. When I went back 2 days later to file a copy for the requester, 14B wasn't where I'd left it. The gap in the box row had been filled with a different hand-labeled reel. 14B, same pen, same fuzzy felt tip, but the masking tape had the new brightness of adhesive that hasn't had the chance to become tea-colored. I signed the checkout log to see who had touched the shelf and found my own name and no others, and beneath the last line of entries a faint pencil tick in the margin that didn't align with any box. A resting point, the way you mark where you've stopped reading and plan to return. That night, when the refrigerator cut off, the subtracting made a shape I know now and would prefer not to. In the quiet that follows the end of a small, honest machine sound, something else in me counts out one beat, then another, then looks up, as if waiting for a door not on any plan to look back. When I finally slept, I dreamed in steady frames, tiles passing, a seam in paint, and the sensation of my own breath entering a building through a reader's lamp as if the lamp were a mouth. In the morning, the print on my hall table had curled a little at the corners, the way paper does when it remembers humidity you didn't feel in the room. I pressed it flat and it held, the way a person holds still when they want you to think they are asleep. The banners out front made a kind of cheerful noise even without wind. "Live downtown," said one, and the people on the scrim fencing smiled with the vacant contentment of stock images. Behind them, the building was mostly finished, glass reset to a neat rhythm, balconies in a grid like an argument solved by repetition. A temporary leasing office squatted in the lobby, half desk and a sign-in sheet on a clipboard that kept sliding toward the corner. A woman with a headset waved me toward a ring of keys, then pointed at the elevator and said, "Models on 6, showing only. Please don't move anything." Then she answered her own voice in her ear and mouthed, "I'm sorry," without sound to me, like we were already sharing a secret. New construction has a smell that settles on your tongue as much as your nose. Glue, paint, carpets that have been vacuumed into compliance so recently the pile has a memory of being pressed wrong. The elevator made a sound I recognized. Brand new cables trying to remember how to be quiet. The door opened onto a hallway and a palette called something like Dove or Pearl. Green painter's tape still marked a few corners with little flags like a golf course for small, careful hands. The model unit's door had a plastic tag, 612, and beneath that, in removable vinyl, showing only. Inside, the light was the kind that flatters without admitting it, warm enough to forgive edges, cool enough to photograph without every object insisting on its own shadow. It was staged to look like the version of your life you'd show your best friend if they called ahead and said they were 5 minutes out. The bed wore a snack-sized throw folded into geometry. 2 cups on the counter thought about being coffee. The books on the sideboard were a mood board's dream. Titles printed to not ask anything of you, and spines that did not open if you tried. A bowl held fruit with the surface. Tension of varnish. The bathroom smelled faintly of lemon and the idea of linen. A candle waited on the tub's edge, wick unblackened like a promise nobody planned to call in. The television was a rectangle with nothing to say. The remote was a remote-shaped suggestion with no batteries inside when I lifted it. Lamps were plugged into outlets that had been staged into existence, cords disappearing behind furniture and emerging where they made the best pictures. The thermostat wore a sticker that said, "Do not adjust," in a font that wanted to be friendly and failed. I made my wide shots first because that's the job. Document the number and size of windows, the layout of kitchen to living, the way a prospective tenant might move through the fiction. The hum I live with lately, the one that resolves into my teeth when it wants to, sat comfortably in the background like HVAC done properly. It made the glass seem denser on the balcony door. A marketing packet lay open on the counter with a floor plan that drew the same space in lines. It showed a closet by the entry that, when I looked up, didn't exist. Where the door should have been was painted drywall, unbroken and smooth and just slightly brighter, as if a seam had been convinced to forget itself. I didn't register the red line until I knelt to photograph the toe kick lighting under the kitchen cabinets and saw a faint chalk thread running along the baseboard. Not painted, not tape. Red powder dragged thin, barely there. It tucked under the edge of a rug and continued, becoming less shy when it thought I wasn't looking. The line turned at the entry corner and aimed exactly where the absent closet should have been. It didn't stop. It went across the drywall, a logic that pretended the wall had been the right kind of thing to be crossed. I told myself it was a chalk snap line from when the flooring went in, a mark of alignment. Ant left and not cleaned. But the line was on the walls too, at knee height and not quite level. It felt like instructions written to someone who already knew them. Red chalk is a contractor's whisper. You tense, you pull the string, you snap, and the dust offers a straightness the room can agree on. This line had the forgetfulness of time added, smudged in places by baseboards installed, brushed by a mop that didn't argue, tucked under rugs as if someone had tried to keep it alive as a courtesy. I followed it with the camera, more because my hands wanted a task than because my head thought one was necessary. At the entry, the chalk turned at a neat right angle and crossed the place the brochure insisted was a closet. The drywall surface held it like a secret, faint but present. I put my finger near it and chalk came away, a small insistence staining the glove. The not closet wall didn't sound hollow when I knocked. It sounded like a room the drywall had been meant to enclose but had for some reason shyly stepped back from. Under the bed, the line continued. You learn to scan for tack strips, for unkind nails. My light found only clean carpet, and the thread of red walking the perimeter like a person taking inventory. Kneeling made the room different, quieter, as if the sound system of the space had been designed for someone lower to the ground. At that height, the staple holes became legible, not in the crown molding or the trim, a band of them, a hair above the baseboard, close and regular as pinpricks. If you leaned in and let your eyes soften, groups of 3 and 4 angled into suggestive diagonals and small boxy shapes, not quite letters until they were. Don't step where they rehearse you. Read the wall in an alphabet of absence, not painted, not scratched, just holes no one had filled, communicating by arrangement. I stood up fast enough that my vision took a beat to catch. The apartment had the decency to wait for me, but something in it had shifted its weight to the other hip. The HVAC cut half a tone and held there, breathing in the steady way a metronome breathes when you forget the beat and it's obligated to remind you. I took a picture of the wall holes from my standing height, and in the image on my phone they were only holes again, dots without index. Don't move anything, the leasing woman had said, and I had put my bag by the sofa like a person who always knows where their bag is. When I reached for it, it wasn't where my hand expected. Not far. A shift the size of inattention. The fruit in the bowl angled differently. The anchor banana, it had to be banana, even if it was a fake, rotated its bright arc to face the living room as if to smile for another angle. The remote lay face down, and I did not remember it being face down. I stepped over the chalk line near the balcony door without thinking. The air in the room went still in the clean way a stage goes still when a director raises a hand before a first run. The under-cabinet lights warmed a degree. The bathroom mirror in my periphery caught my head and returned it with a lag I had learned to dread a little. Not theatrical, half a breath late, the exact measure of time it takes to decide not to be afraid. Somewhere inside the ductwork, a soft hiss, a diffuser or a test of the air freshener line, let go a breath. The scent was a hospitality, citrus and linen and suggestion. The sequence arrived without being announced. Lights, kitchen, living, bedroom, hall, on, off, on, like the building was practicing how to welcome. I stepped back across the line, and everything remained as it had decided to be. Lights warm, scent present, the remote and instrument someone had placed where a hand would find it with confidence. I tested the entry door with my foot. The chalk line turned there and continued down the hall more faintly, as if the rehearsal was thinner away from the pageant of the living space. I checked the floor plan again. The closet on the brochure's drawing called out in letters that felt borrowed from other rooms. I knocked on the wall where it should be once more, lighter, and the paint surface tightened under my knuckle, the way a drum tells you there's a hand on it somewhere you can't see. I wanted to believe a human reason lived inside, don't step where they rehearse you. A designer's joke. A caution from a subcontractor to another, not to scuff the line the show team would need to stage their walkthroughs. I have been a person on the other side of tours. I know the way agents are taught where to stand to reveal a room's depth, how to open a balcony door with your wrist so your fingerprints don't glare in late light. But the holes were too patient to be a joke. They had been made deliberately in a line that lived for reading sideways. I took my photographs anyway because a file is a file. In 2 of them, the timestamp duplicated itself. Same minute, same second, 2 different exposures of the living room where the fruit bowl angled politely first one way, then the other. I did not notice until later. In the moment, I thought about the low note in my teeth when the HVAC paused and re-entered, the way the mirror at the Historical Society had learned to give me back a room I hadn't quite finished making yet. The chalk line marked the places the room knew itself. Crossing it felt like stepping into a sentence that had been practiced for me. I left the unit the way you leave a room after you've woken up in the dark and touched the wall to find the light, deliberate, palms unhelpfully empty. I put the keys back on the leasing desk. The woman's headset blinked an LED heartbeat, and she smiled with her mouth while her attention lived elsewhere. "All good?" she said. "Habit talking." "Fine," I said, which is the word I use when I am a person in a building rather than what the building I face is making me into. On my way out, a man in a developer's polo guided two prospective tenants up the steps, speaking choreographed language. "Imagine Sunday mornings here," he said, "and watch your sightlines. Ah, great. Now step here." He moved them to exactly where the chalk line turned by the entry. One of them looked relieved to be told where to put their feet. Back at my desk, I added my photographs to the folder the city keeps for proofs of promises made. I wrote the caption copy I always write. Unit meets model standards. Finishes match submitted spec. Note baseboard transitions. Floor plan varies slightly at entry. I did not include the chalk line. I wrote closet omitted in constructed unit. No negative impact to egress. And then deleted no negative impact. Left it plain. I typed staging markers present and deleted markers, left staging present and deleted staging. What stayed? Perimeter shows evidence of chalk. Assume alignment during flooring. Rational explanations lined up like file folders. A show team snapped a chalk line to guide their rehearsed route. Someone stapled floor runners for a VIP walkthrough, the holes reading as letters only because I wanted them to. The missing closet was a late plan revision the brochure hadn't caught. The light sequencing was a programmable scene I triggered by stepping where a sensor lives. HVAC tones blend with stress and with memories of other buildings until your molars make their own weather. Each felt correct and left the aftertaste of something clean and invented. At home, I took my shoes off and found a faint red smear along the right sole. I told myself it could have been any construction dust from any hallway. I wiped it on a paper towel, and the towel kept the color politely, without argument. I set my keys in the bowl I always set them in, and in the mirror by the door the bowl sat empty for Hal. A breath, then held my keys. I stared at the baseboard like it had a story to confess. The seam of paint there showed nothing. Dust had collected in a line as dust does. I listened to the refrigerus. The seam of paint there showed nothing. Dust had collected in a line as dust does. I listened to the refrigerator find its low note and release it. The subtracting when it stopped left a familiar shape. I resisted the impulse to map a safe path through my own apartment. Sleep came in fits. In the ones that counted, a voice, not a voice, but a rhythm, counted me through a show file. Kitchen, living, balcony, turn, bedroom, hall, open palm on the bathroom door, move the remote to the angle that reads as ease. In the still patches between dreams, I kept my feet to the edges of the bed without meaning to, like a child auditioning for something they don't want. I woke with the sense that if I stepped wrong in my own rooms, the day might not arrive where I was standing. A week later, an email arrived from the developer's coordinator. "Thanks for the set. Quick note, please be mindful not to cross the red perimeter during photos next time. Our scent cycles are sensitive to foot traffic and we try to preserve the guest route." I read it 3 times. I had crossed the line. They couldn't have known unless someone had watched me, or unless the room had copied me into a system that called itself a scent cycle. I typed a reply about future caution and didn't send it. I went to the hall table and opened the ledger to the last page. A pencil tick had appeared in the margin near my name. A tiny mark like you make when you return to a book at the place where you left off. It could have been there before. It could be nothing. I closed the ledger and put it down like it had become a prop I was being trusted to carry convincingly. Now, in any new room, my eye travels to the seams. I look for chalk. I watch the floor plan I've been handed against the walls that have been built and try not to feel like it matters where they disagree. I pause before stepping from kitchen tile to living room. Wood, because some part of me believes the room wants to show me something only if I stand where it has learned I will understand it best. When I walk down my own hallway at night, I take the long side instead of the middle and tell myself it's because the rug lies better there. I know it isn't. I know I'm trying to keep from discovering what it feels like to be rehearsed by a place that calls itself home. For weeks I had been careful to act like a person surrounded by rooms that meant no more than rooms. It didn't hold. You can only file so many reports that mention the temperature of a hush or the way a reflection prefers the future before your desk becomes a platform and your elbows become a ritual. One wet evening, I could hear the rain picking at the awning above the upholstery shop like a polite guest. I took the ledger out from the hall table and set it open on the floor where the boards are least willing to pretend they are level. I say floor, but I mean staging. The apartment felt that way, arranged for a demonstration. I had gathered other things I didn't intend to gather. The microfilm print sat there, curling at two corners like a small animal protecting its belly. The treatment card from the mirror, my note about minor temporal lag, lay on top of a stack of inspection tags with my handwriting from years back. Schools and storefronts and one warehouse with an elevator that still practiced the first half of a sentence it would never get to finish. Behind them, folded in four, the model unit pamphlet with the missing closet circled twice and then erased. The herbarium volunteer badge, its clip leaving a mark on the wood like a first attempt at a bite. I had set a packet of takeout salt on the ledger, the way a person sets down a coin to say you are real. Show me something that costs. The ledger's last page had stopped trying to look innocent. My name sat where it had sat since the crawl space, patient, with the pencil tick in the margin, like a breath I had left there while reading. The rubber stamp, the one that had made so many returned incomplete, had not been used. In its place, very faint and stubborn, the same word the microfilm margin had tried out and then swallowed, returning. The time field had given up numbers and held a blank like a held note. If I angled the lamp, graphite I hadn't put down, made the paper look burnished where a hand might rest. On a pad I started writing, not to make sense but to keep the room honest. Keep the salt undisturbed, not for first sight. Don't step where they rehearse you, not on plan, carry over. Keep open. These weren't prophecies, they were the opposite. Directions for staying, for standing, for giving a thing enough room to be itself without me filling it with my head. The pen made a rhythm I recognized. The switchboard's pauses come home to the body. The air held that winter-clean note from the herbarium specimen, the one that found the back corners of my mouth. The refrigerator's compressor tripped and ran and cut off, and in the subtracting after it cut off the apartment found the outline of itself, the way hospitals do after mopping, the way a model unit does after the show team leaves and the scent cycle keeps time. The mirror by the door gave me back my hand half a breath behind as I reached to move the fern out of the ledger's way. The fern carried a tidy efflorescence halo that had no business looking like salt and still did. Under the rug by the hall, where I had never looked because there are certain domestic ignorances you maintain if you want to continue living where you live, a faint line of red came away on my fingers when I adjusted the corner. Chalk, not much. The suggestion of straightness someone else had believed in here before me. The staple holes near the baseboard, nothing I had ever given attention to, organized themselves into rows that under tired eyes made the kind of shapes that aren't letters until a person who has already become attached to letters kneels to read them. You don't approach your own walls as if they have something to say, unless you have run out of other rooms. I was close. Even before I admitted it, I knew the story I had been withholding. It was the moment I was about to choose. Whether to answer a call you can't point at without pointing at your teeth, your breath, the exact way your apartment lights warm when you take a step you've taken 1,000 times. The ninth story doesn't wait. It arranges. It was my turn to either let it finish or refuse to be tuned. Part 2. The Incident. It did not begin with the phone. I learned that the night at the switchboard. Phones are props that play recordings of what the building already knows. It began when the refrigerator cut off and the quiet that followed carried a flavor like tile cooling after a scrub. The room took a small inhalation not meant for lungs. The mirror by the door showed the bowl on the table empty and then, as if remembering itself, full of my keys. The pressure at the seam of paint where the hallway meets the bedroom tickled the stand of hair at my temple like a draft I could not find the source of. I put my ear to the seam. Old habit, a childhood game of listening to the ocean in a shell made very literal. There was no ocean, only that two-note hum that makes the bones of your face think you are an instrument. I had learned the rhythm it wanted from the hospital line. I matched my breath to where the pauses fell. My mouth filled with the copper of coins. The negative pressure against the wall drew softly against my cheek as if the apartment were checking that I was the person it had measured for. I don't know if I meant to do what I did next. The putty knife was in the drawer with the rags because I keep useful things together. It is not symbolic. I slid the blade under the stripe of paint where the drywall tape had been blended too generously. The seam lifted without argument, the way a door opens when two people on either side decide at once. Cold, the clarity of mint wall. Ked my wrist and made a path up my arm. The space behind wasn't a gap so much as a decision. The plaster in there smelled like brine and lemon and the faint ferric dull of old handprints. On the backside of the drywall, a shadow of graphite. Someone had written, and the letters had telegraphed. I bent the light until they came forward, not for first sight. The same script, the same careful retraced strokes like the hand that had written it hadn't believed itself the first time. Inside, foil-faced insulation flared like a fish. A staple pinged into the baseboard and rolled once and lay quiet. At my knees, the rug curled in the wrong direction, as if there had been a chalk line asking it not to, long ago, and the rug remembered. I didn't pull the insulation. I'm proud of that restraint the way people are proud after making a generous decision that cost them something. I put my fingers to the foil the way you put a hand on a window in winter to learn if the air on the other side is still cold. Cold, yes, but not painful. The kind of cold that makes your mouth wet and your teeth full. I spoke my name into the seam, not loud, not brave, an offering. The hum that lives in these stories moved inward a degree, not stronger, closer, as if I had been a porch and now I was a foyer. In the mirror, I was not where I thought I was. For half a breath, the reflection showed the hallway empty, the rug tidy, the bowl holding no keys. I did not turn to catch myself entering. I stayed with the seam, with the listening that had been listening to me. The ledger, where I had left it open on the floor, flapped once, not from any draft I could own, and then lay still. On the last page, the weight of a stamp I could not see landed at once and not at all. The impression wasn't ink, it was a change in the way the paper held light. Returned, no incomplete, not that night. From the seam, a scent rose that was the herbarium's winter made into a medium for memory. Salt, bright enough to clean, lemon that believes itself helpful. A suggestion of camphor from a time when care smelled like someone trying very hard. Water gathered where it shouldn't. Along the baseboard, a line of dew beating and then lifting in the wrong direction, upward. Small spheres choosing to arrive at the seam, as if it were gravity. My fern's fronds lean toward the wall in the drift air currents, make when a room draws breath from a place it has no business breathing from. I breathed with it, not words, the rhythm from the switchboard, in, two, out, hold. A small click answered from inside, not a mechanism exactly, the sound you get when a clipboard is set down just off your line of sight and then aligned. The apartment arranged itself the way the model unit had, lights, kitchen, living bedroom, on, off, on, gentle, like a rehearsal that had finally acquired its missing actor. My jaw loosened, the note in my teeth resolved to something like a chord that had discovered its third. The microfilm print on the floor seemed darker in the corners. In the tiny room within the printed room, the chair I sat in was empty. I did not look down to confirm that I sat there. I stayed with the seam until the mint cold softened into the ordinary, and then, like water deciding it had been enough, the beating on the baseboard receded and left no trace but the feeling in my hand where it had been. I wish I could tell you I did something decisive. I did not. I pressed the seam back with care, a person smoothing a collar before walking into another room. The putty knife left a line I could never unsee and that no one else would notice. The room returned to the shape where refrigerators go on and off because they have to, and lamps work because they do. My hands shook, but not the way hands shake. When a story we tell ourselves calls itself a haunting, it was the shake that follows putting down a weight you hadn't admitted you were carrying. I took a glass of water to my mouth and it tasted like nothing, clean enough to make me grateful for the lie. I covered the ledger the way I had covered the mirror, with something that belonged to the room and could pretend to be a rule. The last page kept its bruise of a stamp. Returned looked like a word placed and then pressed by a hand that was sure. The pencil tick in the margin by my name remained one quiet breath, where a reader had paused and planned to come back. My chair rocked when I sat down, and I let it. The paper shim on the floor felt silly to pick up after the film had shown me a version of the chair that had never had it. Explanations, reasonable, waited at the edge of the bed when I lay down. Stress stitches small pictures together until they feel like cloth. Old buildings sound like your blood when you bring work home. Solvents cause headaches and dreams that line up too neatly. Carbon monoxide can do a lot, but not what I'm describing. Still, I checked the detector. Red chalk in rental buildings is practically paint. Messages on walls are for carpenters, and I am not one. A bad ballast can make reflected life fall out of step for a beat. You can smell lemon in empty rooms because you have smelled it so often. People stamp words into paper by wanting them there. Each of these considers the event kindly. None of them changes the fact that I answered something in my wall and it let me know it had been waiting for me to learn how. I didn't tell anyone, not Marta, not the curator, not Arliss. I wrote nothing formal. The incident log at the city is fat enough without me teaching it new ways to make a person into its instrument. Instead, I did what's asked of me, what I have always done. I maintain perimeters I don't fully understand. I put a ring of salt, real, table, foolish, along the baseboard where the seam had talked to my ear. I dusted the red chalk I had collected into a line that made a circuit from hall to kitchen to bed and back. I moved the mirror by the door to somewhere it couldn't catch my face in passing unless I wanted it to. The fern got a saucer, and I told it aloud that anything it wanted to give back to air could be done slowly. The apartment's sounds acquired loyalties. The refrigerator subtracting sounds like relief now. The radiator ticking in cold weather taps the sequence the model unit used in Welcome. The phone is only a phone again, except for the days when a pause falls in the wrong place and I answer to a breath. My molars still flare when I stand in a building, and it changes its mind about quiet. Once, a week after the seam, the bowl on the table sat empty a second longer than it should have after I dropped my keys. That second closed behind itself like a cut remembered by skin. Here is what I have without polish. I do not think there is an it in the way we like to attach pronouns to unknowns. If there is, it isn't interested in being named. What listens back is the arrangement of everything that wasn't meant to be seen once put next to everything that was. Salt where it should be plaster, breath where it should be signal, rehearsal where it should be living, rooms that mean you without saying so. It taught me its timing, and waited to see if I would hold it steady long enough for it to use. I did, for a moment. I don't know what that makes me. A reed? An ear? The patient part of a circuit that wanted a 1 and wanted a 0 and found instead a person with a bad habit of noticing. I've moved since. That's true. A different topography of creeks, a different hum shot down new ducks. I keep the ledger zipped and do not open to the last page unless I am ready to see that word again, and when I do, it is still there, inkless and sure, returned. The column next to it is still titled Incomplete, whether or not anyone decides to press the stamp. In my new place, the baseboards are honest. The mirror gives me back exactly what I offer it, and no more. The herb smell visits on cold mornings and leaves without searching drawers. Some nights the building takes a small breath before the elevator arrives, and my teeth answer. Some days I stand in a corridor and find the seam that is not on any plan and do not test it. I have learned the small mercy of letting rooms keep the arrangements that let them live. But on the worst nights, when I mistake a pause for a question and answer, the apartment dresses itself like the model unit for a beat. Lights in sequence, air sweet and clean and terrible, my name fitted into the hush in the place where a name could do the most good, and I stand where I have been rehearsed to stand, and the air tastes like winter, and I understand that what listens back is not the other. It is the place made from the negative of me that waits just beyond the wall for me to keep it open.